In this video, we're going to go over the initial steps of creating a table in SQL. So the create table syntax looks like this. We say create table. Now, if not exists is optional, indicated by the square brackets. Don't include the square brackets if you try to use if not exists. But basically what if not exists is going to do is it's going to check to see the name of the table that we provided already exists in the database. If it does, it will skip over this query and move to the next query. If it doesn't exist, it will go ahead and create that table. So we're going to say create table. If not exists, the name of the table. Notice the name of the table is in tick marks. These tick marks are actually the key above the tab key, not the single quote. So if you choose to provide the tick marks, make sure you use the key above the tab key. I will not be using tick marks. The only reason why I have them here is in some cases, if you try to create a table with a reserved keyword such as order, it will fail. And this would ensure that this would work for every situation. So after we've done that, we're going to specify all the columns. These are going to be the fields that come from our relational model. So we're going to list the column name and then the column definition. For column definition, we have data type, we have not null and null, a default value, whether auto increments, and the column constraints, which include primary key and foreign key constraints. We will cover all this in this video and subsequent videos. So the first step of creating a table is to identify the data types. There are several kinds of data types. The first type that we're going to talk about is text data types. The ones in blue are the ones that you need to be most concerned about. So char is a fixed character length. So if I say char 5, it's only going to allow 5 characters in this cell of the table. However, since it's fixed characters, it's always going to take up 5 characters of space, regardless of whether or not I provide 1 character or 5 characters. Varchar, on the other hand, is variable character length. So for example, if I provide 2 characters, it's going to only take up 2 characters of space in the database. Whereas if I provide 100 characters, it will take up 100 characters of space in the database. Blob is used for storing files. Text is for anything larger than 255 characters. There is also tiny text, medium text, and long text. Enum and set allow you to store a list of values in your database. Enum is different than set in that it has some semblance of order to it. So for example, if I had a list of 4 values for standing, such as freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, if I put them in that order, it will have that order when I try to sort by this column. Another type of data type is the number data type. You need to be concerned with integer and double. Integer is going to allow up to 10 numbers. Double is going to allow numbers with decimals. There's tiny int, small int, medium int, big int. Big int is for anything bigger than an integer, such as like a phone number. A lot of phone numbers, if you have more than the typical 10 characters, you're going to fall outside of this. So big int might be a good choice to use. Float is a smaller double, and decimal is a double that is stored as a string, which is basically stored as text. The next type of data type is date. Date records the date. Date time records the date and time. Time records the time, and year records the year. Timestamp is going to actually get the current timestamp of now. In order to do this, we would write the create table script, create table customer, and then list out all the fields, and then we're going to identify the data types for each. From our relational model, we see the data types on the right, and so we're going to use those on the left. So we're going to say integer, and then for varchar, we need to specify the number of characters, same with char. Date time for order date, and that's how we specify the data types. For step 2, we are going to now identify the null and not null columns, the columns that for sure have to have values. So essentially all of these need to have values. For sure, the primary key columns are going to need to have values. So now what I want you to do is start writing the statements that would create these tables on your own. Don't actually execute the queries to create these tables, just start it, because we're going to be adding to these queries. As you go through this, make sure you specify the data types for each attribute, and then identify the columns that can and cannot be null. So to help you get started, I'm going to go over to my server and show you a little bit of how this is done. So here I am on my server homepage. I'm going to be using my personal schema, so make sure your personal schema is selected here. And then you're going to just start writing queries to create your table. So for the first one, we're going to say create table, and then the name of the table, which is employee. We'll open our parentheses, which should automatically close it too. I'll move that to a new line. And then I'm going to start adding all the fields. So we have employee ID, name, and birth date. And then I'm going to go ahead and identify all the data types for each one of these. So we know this one is integer. Name we're going to say is varchar, and we'll say that it is about 50 characters long. And then birth date we will say is date. Each one of these columns must have a comma after it, and then we're going to specify the columns that can and cannot be nulls. So since employee ID is going to be our primary key, I'm going to say not null. And then for name, I'm going to also say is not null. And then let's say that we don't really need to have birth date, so I'll just go ahead and keep that as null just to give you an additional example. So now that I've walked you through this first one, go ahead and start writing the start of your queries for certificate and course. Pause this video and then come back to compare your answers. All right, welcome back. So we're going to go ahead and create two new tables called certificate and course. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy employee twice, and we'll change this to match what we need to. I'm going to change this next one to course because we want to start with the parent tables first, those that have the primary keys first before we create the tables with the foreign keys. So for course, I'm going to have course ID as an integer as well, and it's going to be not null. I'm going to have a title and a description. Now both of these fields are going to be varchar or text. If I do varchar, I think the title will be at least 255 characters. And the description, although it says on the slide should be varchar, if I have more than 255 characters, I would probably want it to be text. Let's say that the description is also not null. Then I'm going to come down to the next table, and I'm going to name it certificate. And the attributes of certificate are employee ID and course ID. So I'm going to just duplicate employee ID and add course ID. And then we want just the date that the course was completed. And rather than just date, we probably also want the time. So we'll call this date time. And we'll say that this is also not null.